Good morning everyone and welcome to what I guess is a little bit of an emergency edition of On The Whistle, because we have some fairly big Sunderland transfer news to talk about in April, which is quite an unusual situation, but that's where we are. So I'm sure you've all seen the news last night that Tommy Watson, Sunderland have agreed a deal to sell Tommy Watson to Brighton and Hove Albion. That'll go through on July the 1st when the transfer window opens, regardless of what happens between now and the end of the season. All the agreement's all done and signed. So I'm going to chat a little bit through some of my thoughts and feelings about the deal, give you hopefully a little bit of insight into what the deal actually is. And then I'll go through some of the kind of the key questions that are thrown up from this. Took a few questions from people over on Blue Sky around the deal. I'm not going to go through each one individually, but what I have done is collated sort of the big talking points that people are asking about. And I'll just give you some of my opinion on that, hopefully maybe a little bit of behind the scenes insight as well. So I think the first thing to do really is just talk a little bit about the deal itself. So from my understanding, the talks have pretty much continued since deadline day. I think everybody knows that the last two deadline days, Brighton have made multiple attempts to try and sign Tommy Watson. I don't think it was ever particularly close last summer, last deadline day, but certainly deadline day this year it was the January transfer window, but I think deadline day was in February, which was confusing for everybody. And the deal was very, 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 very close. Ultimately, it didn't go through. Mainly, to be honest, because Sunderland were concerned about a lack of a replacement. But Brighton have been quite persistent since then in keeping the deal open. Tommy Watson's now gone into the last 18 months of his contract, and I think Sunderland have probably known for a while that the chances of reaching an agreement on an extension are pretty minute. I think that's something that's only kind of grown since the end of the January transfer window. And so I think Sunderland felt that the best thing to do was to negotiate now. Obviously, depending on who you speak to, you'll get slightly different views on what the deal is and what it looks like. But I think what we can say with a large degree of certainty is that it's a package in the region of 10 million. I think if all the add-ons and performance-related clauses were reached, Sunderland would bank around £11 million. And from what I gather, Sunderland think that they're fairly realistic clauses. They're not like, if Tommy Watson wins the Ballon d'Or, which he might do, but, feels like a little bit of a stretch, they're fairly realistic clauses that could be met. So, yeah, we think potentially over a period of time, a fee that could be worth around 11 million. I think crucially as well, I understand there's a pretty significant sell-on clause involved in this as well, in the region of 20%. So Sunderland, if Watson was to go on and realise his full potential and become that top tier player, then obviously there would be a significant financial benefit to Sunderland from that as well. So that's kind of the deal. That's kind of the deal that's been done. In terms of my feelings about it, I think it's, in a lot of ways, it's a really disappointing day for Sunderland. We know that trading is just a reality of where they're at. It's something that you have to do, especially, even the clubs with parachute payments have to do it, really. I think it's just the reality of being any team outside the sort of top 6 or 8 in the Premier League, to be honest. I think the sadness with Watson comes in that we've only really seen glimpses of what he can actually do. I think that he's someone who in the under-21s, when we watched him for a while, was really banging the door down and producing unbelievable performances that showed you what an incredible talent he is. We only really got a glimpse of that before he suffered that injury towards the back end of last year. And so I think there's a little bit of a sadness that one of Sunderland's best prospects really in recent years, and I think anybody who spent time in the academy or watches a lot of academy football will tell you that Watson definitely is one of the best prospects we've seen for quite some time, is leaving before he's really had a chance to make his mark. And there's a bit of disappointment in that. Putting your sort of cold business head on, I guess, which is the other side of it and how I feel about this deal, is that let's be honest, it's a good deal. It's a significant injection of funds into the club for a player who, let's not forget, has only made 16 senior appearances so far. A really, really talented player, but nobody can say for sure what level he'll reach in the future. And I think for a player who's coming towards the end of his contract to get that level of fee, I don't think you can argue that Sunderland have done a sort of a good job on that. So, yeah, really mixed feelings about it. Obviously, because to lose a player who's come through the club, I think Watson joined Sunderland at the age of 6, I think to lose him, it is a really sad day in some ways, but at the same time, it's a real, it shows you the level of work that's getting done in the academy, that players want, the Premier League clubs want to come and sign players for this level of funds. And it's also one that just strengthens someone's financial position further. So there is that sort of positive to it. Go through some of the questions, some of the things that a lot of people were asking about, really, just in terms of this deal, and see if I can give you a little bit of opinion, a little bit of insight. So the first thing a lot of people are saying is, why now? obviously really unusual for a deal to be announced on April the 1st, outside of a transfer window. I think there's a few different layers to this. So the first one really is that although it's very unusual for transfer deals to get done in April outside the transfer window, it's not as unusual for Brighton. I think if you look at the way Brighton do business, they tend to be quite proactive. They sometimes do deals outside transfer windows. It's not unusual for them. The reason they're able to do that is because their financial position is outstanding because of the players that they've sold. And that allows them to be really, really proactive, to steal a march on other clubs, to always be looking for opportunities and basically to move whenever the opportunity is there. So I think that's a little bit why this has happened. It's not just about Sunderland, it's most definitely about Brighton and the way they do their business. And to be honest, I think it's something for all clubs, including Sunderland, to aspire to. I think to get yourself in a position where you can be proactive like this. I think once the deal is done, you then basically have two options, which is you try and just sort of rumble along till the end of the season, keep it under wraps and announce it when the transfer window opens. My impression from speaking to various sources is that Sunderland's view was that it was likely to come out in some shape or form once the agreement was reached, and that rather than letting the potential uncertainty and speculation cloud the end of the season, rather than having Régis Lebris asked about it in press conferences, rather than that question mark hanging over Tommy as he tries to make an impact, the best thing was to just say, look, this is what's happening. Obviously, we're sad to see Tommy go, but it's a good deal. It allows everyone to just know where they stand, and we can now focus on the final 7, hopefully 10 games of the season. So I think that's why the decision to sort of just go public with this was made. From a Sunderland perspective, in terms of why do it now, why not do it at the end of the season, I think there's a reality here, which is that, as I mentioned, Sunderland have known for a while really that Watson was minded not to sign a new contract. I think that we'll all have our opinions on that. I think from Watson's perspective, I think the one thing you would have to say is if you're going to move to a Premier League club at his age, Brighton would be the one, wouldn't it? Because they're the club, that kind of similar to Sunderland in the Championship. They're the one club where you look at it and you go, yeah, like they will give him a chance if he impresses in training. If they feel he's ready, he'll play. They've got absolutely no fears throwing an 18 or a 19-year-old into Premier League football. So I can see from his perspective why this move was appealing. And it's slightly different to sometimes when you see young players make a move and you think, I can't really see the logic in that. I worry that they might be making that for the wrong reasons. I think there is a strong footballing argument for this move. But from Sunderland's perspective, they'd known for a while that Watson was minded not to extend. Actually, as a little bit of an aside, there was quite a lot of interest in Watson before he signed his first professional contract, and potentially he could have gone for what would have been a pretty paltry compensation fee then. So I think there's also a little bit of realism here that to bank in potentially in excess of 10 million for a player who nearly left for what would have been a pittance really 18 months ago is a pretty good outcome in some ways. But I think from someone's perspective, knowing that Watson was unlikely to extend his contract, there was a huge risk in not taking this very, very good deal now. And that's partially why Brighton have put the deal on the table now and have kept those talks going, because they understand that, and it's partially why someone have decided to do the deal. What if Watson gets a serious injury in the last 7 games of the season? Sorry about that, it was very dramatic. What if Watson gets a significant injury in the last sort of 7 games of the season? You're then potentially going into a summer window where these kind of bids wouldn't be on the table if he had an injury, for example. What if his form doesn't quite reach the level that we saw towards the end of last year? I think it's obvious that the more time went on, the closer Sunderland got to the end of Watson's current deal, the weaker negotiating position they were in. And I think that's why they've decided to do this deal now, because there was some significant risk allowing it to run into the summer, and especially next January, when you're then potentially losing a player for a pretty small sum. So yeah, it's always going to be a divisive one. I understand everyone's opinions on it, but I think hopefully I've given you a little bit of insight into both clubs, really, the thinking in terms of why they were having to do this now. One of the questions that people were asking a lot was, I think, understanding why Sunderland have done this, but why not do it in January? Basically, Sunderland were fairly open to doing this in January in terms of they understood that Watson was quite keen on the move, or was certainly very open to the move. Don't think they have a problem with that. They understand young players who want to move to the Premier League, obviously disappointing for the club. But put very simply, Régis Lebris wanted 2 left wingers, felt he needed 2 left wingers. At that point, Romain Mundle was still injured, so he didn't have any left wingers. And so the view was that Watson could only go and if a replacement arrived. And actually one of the reasons why it ran so close to the wire on deadline day was because Sunderland were in talks to sign Simon Adingra from Brighton, who would have been pretty much a direct replacement. Now, for one or two reasons, that in the end didn't go through, and that really sort of hardened Sunderland's stance that they couldn't really afford to let Watson go, that it would be too big a risk with Mundell also out injured at the time. So that's why they didn't do it in January. A couple of additional things people mentioned was one, why not let him go in January and loan Jack Clarke back? I think the reality is that if that had been a deal on the table, Sunderland would have done it. From my understanding, there wasn't a question of Ipswich letting Clarke go in January. Sunderland also, from my understanding, had an interest in Nathan Broadhead and bringing him back to the club in January, but ultimately he was kind of in the team at the time and Ipswich didn't want to let him go. So on the Clarke thing, I think that's definitely something they would have been open to, but it wasn't really an option. Some people also saying that you could have let Watson go in January and keep Adil Awshish, which is definitely one that I can totally understand, because we saw Awshish have a bit of an impact around the Christmas period. I think the reality is Lebris wanted two out-and-out wingers. Awshish did a really, really good job, there's no denying that. But Sunderland's system is set up to feed wingers early, wingers who can go past players, very, very good in 1v1 duels. That's so much of what the game plan is built around. And I think Lebris, I don't think he particularly wanted to go into the rest of the season, if Mundell hadn't recovered as everyone hoped, potentially without an out-and-out left winger. So that was why they were, I think, happy to move Awshish on. I think there was also a bit of a realism that, you know, they couldn't really stand Awshish's way. They had to let him go somewhere where he could play more regular football in his best position. So hopefully that answers kind of that side of things. And one of the other things that a lot of people were asking about was, should we be fearful of the summer transfer window? Is this a sign of things to come? Or some of you were saying, does this really strengthen Sunderland's hand? Well, I think there's two aspects to this. Is one, that it definitely makes me a little bit fearful for the summer, because I think it just goes to show how hard it is to stop players going to the Premier League. And especially because some of the sums involved. And so it does make me a little bit fearful if Sunderland don't win promotion, because I think you can see that there are clubs lining up to sign Sunderland's talent, and I think in some cases it'll be really, really hard to stand in their way. So it is definitely something that makes me a little bit nervous. I think the other side of this is that what this deal also does is it sets a little bit of a marker down in terms of the only real players that Sunderland are in a similarly vulnerable contract situation to Tommy Watson are with Dan Neil and Dennis Serkin, who will both have 12 months left on their deal in the summer. Sunderland are definitely quite vulnerable in those situations in the same way they are with Watson. But with other players who Premier League clubs might want to sign, they have significantly longer a run on the contracts. They have significantly more experience in senior football under their belt. And so I think for Sunderland to bank around 10 million from this deal sets a real marker down, that if those players do go in the summer, that if they do want to take an opportunity to go and play in the Premier League or a top division elsewhere in Europe, I think Sunderland can really put their foot down and say, you know, there is no need for us to sell on the cheap. We're in a strong financial position. You know, the last accounts were kind of mixed reading, but showed that Sunderland are on a better financial footing than most of their championship rivals. Since then, they've sold Jack Clarke for 15 million, Tommy Watson for around 10 million. That tells you that they're attacking this window from a real position of strength. And so I think that means that if they do sell players, you know, they can really command the top dollar for them. So while I'm definitely nervous about it, I do think that we'll be in a very different position to most transfer windows if that does happen, because the scope for reinvestment at Sunderland will be huge, and obviously it'll then be down to the recruitment team to get the right players. The last thing some of you talking about was whether really Tommy Watson can or should play a part for the rest of the season. For me, it's just down to training. I've got no issue whatsoever with Watson sort of being part of it in terms of it's modern football. I don't think there's anything unusual in what's happened. A fantastic opportunity's been presented to him. If it was me, I would stay and play at Sunderland forever because it's my club. But you know, that's easy for me to say sitting here. It's easy for us all to say. I think the reality is he's been presented with a quite incredible opportunity to go and play for a club that's competing at the top end of the Premier League, and potential for European football in the next couple of years. That shows that it trusts young players. Can totally understand why he's made the decision, and ultimately it will be up to Lebris. I think if Watson is showing that he's motivated in training, if he's performing well in training, if he's hungry for it, then Sunderland need him, and he can absolutely have a massive role to play between now and the end of the season. I think it's on Tommy now to show that he can kind of be that difference maker in games. Could he be the guy who gets you through a playoff off the bench, who could score a winner at Wembley off the bench? I think that's the sort of gauntlet that needs to be laid down for him. I've got absolutely no issues with Tommy being a big part of Sunderland's squad between now and the end of the season. I think ultimately it's just down to how he trains. It'll be up to Labrise to make that decision on what kind of position he's in and how he progresses from there. So yeah, I've been talking for 15 minutes. I always talk much longer than I planned to, but hopefully, it's given you a little bit of insight into how this developed. There is a sort of sadness, I think, about losing an academy player, especially one who hasn't really had a chance to fully show what he's all about at the club, mainly through injury, really, to be fair. But at the same time, I think it's, from a Sunderland perspective, it was a deal that ultimately probably was a little bit too good to turn down, is my kind of take on it. So yeah, hopefully this has given you a little bit of insight, a little bit of behind the scenes insight into how the deal's come back as well. So yeah, we'll be doing kind of a written version reflecting on this, which will be on the website, hopefully around lunchtime, maybe tea time. So keep your eyes out for that as well. I'll go into a bit more depth on some of this stuff, and there'll be stacks more content in the days to come. So thanks for watching.